It is June 1978, and Gordon Murray has a problem. Not a technical problem, a political one. The car he has designed is sitting in the Brabham garage at Anderstorp, Sweden, about to compete in its first and, though nobody knows it yet, its only Formula One race. It has passed scrutineering. It is legal. Every regulation has been checked, rechecked, and checked again. The FIA has seen it. The stewards have inspected it. Nobody has found a single rule it breaks. And yet every other team on the grid knows, with absolute certainty, that what Brabham has built is a machine that should not exist. By the time you understand what Gordon Murray put inside the BT46B, you will understand why this car won its only race by a margin that made the timing screens look like they had malfunctioned, and why it was withdrawn from competition 6 days later, never to race again. It remains the only undefeated Formula One car in history. This is the Brabham BT46B, and this is the story of how one engineer's idea was so far ahead of the regulations that the sport had to rewrite the rulebook around stopping it after it was already too late. To understand why Gordon Murray built what he built, you have to understand the problem he was trying to solve in 1978. The problem was Lotus. Colin Chapman's Lotus 78 and its successor, the Lotus 79, had arrived in Formula One carrying a concept that was, in retrospect, the most significant aerodynamic breakthrough the sport had seen since the introduction of wings in 1968, ground effect. The idea was simple in principle and extraordinarily difficult in execution. Seal the underside of the car from the surrounding airflow using sliding skirts that ran along the track surface and shape the floor like an inverted wing to generate low pressure beneath the car. The result was downforce that increased with speed. The faster you went, the harder the car was pushed into the ground, without the corresponding drag penalty that conventional wings imposed. Mario Andretti and Ronnie Peterson, driving the Lotus 78 and 79 in 1977 and 1978, were simply in a different category from the rest of the field, not marginally faster, structurally faster. On circuits where ground effect worked well, Andretti was lapping in times that teams with ostensibly comparable power outputs could not approach regardless of wing angle or setup change. Every team in Formula One was scrambling to understand and replicate what Lotus had done. But replication took time, wind tunnel hours, development resources, engineering talent, and crucially, it required a car that had been designed from the outset around ground effect principles, the side pod geometry, the floor shape, the skirt system. All of it had to be integrated at the concept stage, not bolted onto an existing design. The Brabham BT46, the car Murray had designed for the 1978 season, had a fundamental problem in this regard. It was powered by the Alfa Romeo Flat 12 engine, a wide, low unit that produced exceptional power but occupied exactly the space in the car's underfloor where the ground effect tunnels needed to be. The Lotus 79 side pods worked because the Ford Cosworth DFV V8 was narrow enough to leave room for properly shaped Venturi tunnels on either side of the engine. The Alfa Romeo Flat 12 was not narrow. It was, aerodynamically speaking, a disaster. A wide, flat engine that blocked the underbody airflow almost completely and made conventional ground effect implementation essentially impossible on the BT46. Murray understood this before the season began. He understood it in the wind tunnel, where the BT46 underbody numbers were mediocre regardless of what his aerodynamics tried. The car was quick in a straight line. The Alfa Romeo's power output was competitive, but in the corners, against a Lotus 79 with its ground effect working properly, it was giving away time it could not recover. He needed a solution that did not depend on the underbody. A solution that could generate the downforce the BT46 needed without requiring Venturi tunnels that the Alfa Romeo engine had made impossible. What he came up with was, by any reasonable assessment, either a stroke of genius or an act of deliberate regulatory provocation, depending on your perspective and which team you drove for. A fan, not a decorative fan, not a cooling aid that happened to produce a minor aerodynamic benefit. A large, engine-driven fan mounted at the rear of the car, rotating at high speed, actively extracting air from beneath the floor and exhausting it rearward. The fan would create a low-pressure zone under the car mechanically, doing what the Venturi tunnels did aerodynamically, but doing it through forced extraction rather than passive airflow shaping. The downforce generated would be, in theory, largely independent of road speed. Even at low speed, the fan would be spinning, pumping, creating suction. The car would be pressed to the ground, not by the air rushing under it, but by the air being actively removed from beneath it. The concept was not entirely new. Jim Hall's Chaparral 2J sports car had used a similar twin-fan system in North American racing in 1970, generating enormous downforce before being banned by the Can-Am series. Murray knew the Chaparral. He knew why it had been banned, and he believed, correctly as it turned out, that the Formula One regulations of 1978 contained no specific provision that prohibited a fan of this type on a Grand Prix car. The development of the BT46B was conducted in conditions of extreme secrecy at the Brabham factory in Chessington. The fan itself was a 5-bladed unit, approximately 400 millimeters in diameter, driven from the back of the gearbox through a separate drivetrain. The skirt system that sealed the underfloor was redesigned to work in conjunction with the fan's extraction, creating a more complete low-pressure zone than a passive system could achieve. The rear bodywork was reshaped to accommodate the fan housing and its exit duct. Murray's regulatory argument rested on a single claim. The fan was primarily a cooling device. The Alfa Romeo Flat 12 engine ran hot. Additional cooling was a genuine engineering requirement. The fact that the fan also generated substantial downforce was, in Murray's framing, a secondary consequence of its primary cooling function, and the regulations of the time prohibited movable aerodynamic devices, but made no specific mention of fans fitted for cooling purposes. If the fan was defined as a cooling device rather than an aerodynamic device, it was legal. The argument was thin. Everyone in the paddock knew it was thin. But it was not demonstrably wrong, and in the absence of a clear regulatory prohibition, thin arguments sometimes hold long enough to win a race. Niki Lauda, who was driving for Brabham in 1978 alongside John Watson, tested the BT46B at the Paul Ricard circuit in France before the Swedish Grand Prix. His assessment was immediate and unambiguous. The car felt, in his description, as though it was on a road surface made of a different material from the track every other car was driving on. The downforce levels were extraordinary, not because the numbers were so much higher than the Lotus 79 in absolute terms, but because the downforce arrived differently. It was consistent at all speeds. It did not require the car to be traveling fast to work. In slow corners, in acceleration zones, in braking areas, the suction was always there, always pulling the car down, always giving the tires more grip than they had any right to expect from a 1978 Formula One car. There was another effect that Lauda noticed, and that rival teams would complain about bitterly after the race. The fan's exhaust, the air it expelled rearward after extracting it from under the car, emerged as a high-velocity stream directly into the path of any following vehicle. Embedded in that stream was everything the track surface had to offer: rubber debris, gravel, dust, small stones. Any car attempting to follow the BT46B closely was driving into a continuous blast of track detritus at racing speed. Getting close enough to overtake was not just tactically difficult, it was physically hazardous. The Swedish Grand Prix at Anderstorp on June 17, 1978 was, from a competitive standpoint, not a contest. Lauda qualified on pole. He led from the start. He won by 34.6 seconds from Riccardo Patrese arrows. John Watson, in the second BT46B, finished third. Brabham finished first and third in a race that the Lotus 79, the car that had been dominating the season, could not win despite Andretti qualifying second on the grid. The reaction from rival teams was immediate and volcanic. Protests were filed before the checkered flag had fully dropped. The Lotus team, Ferrari, Tyrrell, and others argued that the fan was a movable aerodynamic device prohibited under the existing regulations. Brabham maintained it was a cooling device. The stewards at Anderstorp declined to disqualify the car, ruling that the fan's primary purpose was cooling and that the existing regulations did not clearly prohibit it. What happened next is the part of this story that most histories do not fully examine. Because the BT46B was not banned by the stewards at Anderstorp, it was not disqualified. The results stood. Lauda's victory was confirmed, and yet the car never raced again. Bernie Ecclestone, who owned the Brabham team and who was simultaneously in the process of consolidating his political power over Formula One as the chief executive of the Formula One Constructors Association, made a decision that was commercial and political rather than technical. The BT46B, if raced for the remainder of the 1978 season, would almost certainly have won the championship. It was that fast, and the regulations that prohibited it clearly enough to trigger a disqualification did not yet exist. But racing it would have required a sustained regulatory battle with the FIA, a war with every other constructor, and a level of political capital that Ecclestone calculated was not worth spending, particularly when he had larger ambitions for the sport's commercial future that required the cooperation of the teams he would be fighting. The BT46B was withdrawn, voluntarily, by the team that had built it and won with it. Murray went back to the drawing board and developed a conventional ground effect car, the BT48, for the following season. The fan car went into storage. The championship that year was won by Mario Andretti in the Lotus 79. The regulatory response came afterward, as it always does in Formula One. The 1979 technical regulations were amended to explicitly prohibit fans and any powered device that generated aerodynamic downforce. The amendment was written specifically and directly because of what Gordon Murray had built. The sport had not banned the BT46B because it found a clear rule it broke. It had changed the rules because the BT46B had revealed a gap large enough to drive a championship through. What the BT46B proved, and what its brief, singular race appearance demonstrated beyond any theoretical argument, was that the boundary between cooling systems and aerodynamic devices was not a technical boundary, it was a regulatory one. And regulatory boundaries are, by definition, defined by language. Language can always be outpaced by engineering. It always has been in Formula One. It always will be. The car's legacy sits in an uncomfortable place in the sport's history. It is remembered as a curiosity, the fan car, the one-race wonder, the machine that was too clever for its own good. But that framing misses what it actually represented. The BT46B was not a trick, it was a solution. Murray had identified a genuine aerodynamic problem, an engine that made conventional ground effect impossible, and had found an engineering answer that was, within the regulations as they existed on the day of the race, entirely legal. The fact that the regulations were changed afterward is not evidence that the car was wrong. It is evidence that the car was right and that the sport's governance moved to close the gap as quickly as it could. Gordon Murray went on to design some of the most celebrated road and racing cars of the following decades. His work on the McLaren F1 road car, the BT52 that won Nelson Piquet his second world championship in 1983, and a series of subsequent projects established him as one of the most inventive automotive engineers of his generation. But the BT46B remains, in the assessment of many who study the technical history of Formula One, his most purely audacious design. Not because it was the most sophisticated, not because it was the most aerodynamically advanced, but because it identified a space between what the regulations said and what physics permitted, and then built exactly the car that fitted into that space. 1 race, 1 victory, 0 defeats. The only undefeated Formula One car in history was withdrawn by its own team before anyone could beat it. That is not a footnote. That is the whole story. A car so fast, so legally untouchable in the moment it raced, that the only way to stop it was to rewrite the language of the sport around it. And by then, the race had already been won. If you found this useful, subscribe. There are more stories like this one in the archive, and more coming. Leave a comment below. Which car should we examine next? The Ferrari F2004 that ended an era, or the McLaren MP44 that won 15 of 16 races in a single season?